Hello and welcome everybody to this event. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Eulalia Iglesias, Communications Manager at the London International Development Centre. For those who don't know us, we are a consortium of 9 London university institutions. Our mission is to support interdisciplinary research to address global challenges. And we are also a membership organization with currently more than 7,000 members working across all areas of global development. You can find more information in our website and follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. And now I will directly hand over to our chairs, Dr. Saleyha Ahsan. She's an emergency medicine doctor and PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Ahsan freelances as filmmaker on content related to healthcare and conflict, and prior to medicine, she was also a British Army officer. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and sorry, I thought I was on mute. Thank you so much for the introduction, and also thank you so much for the invitation to chair such an incredibly important and timely event. I don't think that I need to express the reasons behind why talking about this issue of children in Palestine and the mental health crisis and actions for trauma recovery is just so important and pertinent for now. We all know that. And so for us to gather and to talk and to discuss and to hear from specialists and experts in this area, I think is invaluable and will help arm us with the knowledge and further sort of collective motivation that we need to be addressing this issue. Just some background. I think it's really important to set this scene. There is an annual report of the UN Security General on Children and Armed Conflicts dated June 24. It's really sober and somber reading, and it reports alarming levels of violence inflicted on children in situations of armed conflict in 2023. But the figures are staggering. 21%, there's a 21% increase in grave violations against children documented within the report. That's 21% increase. Children have been recruited and used at the front lines, attacked in their homes, abducted on their way to schools. Their schools were military and bases and used. Their schools and their healthcare workers have been targeted. Over 5,300 children were killed in 2023. 8,655 children were recruited and used for military objectives. 356 children were abducted. For Gaza, I was just looking at these figures, over 20,000 children are estimated to be lost, disappeared, detained, buried under the rubble or in a mass grave. That's 20,000 children lost or disappeared, unaccounted for. Save the Children estimates approximately 21,000 children are missing in Gaza. That's according to Save the Children. And this includes 17,000 unaccompanied separated children and over 4,000 children buried under the rubble. I was just looking at those figures. I looked at my school that I used to go to. That school, it's a comprehensive, over 2,000 children attend that school. That's 10 times my school of children missing. I looked at other schools in the London area. That's between 15 to 20 schools being empty. Can you imagine that? Empty of children. And according to Gaza's Ministry of Health, more than 14,000 children have been killed since the 7th of October. And the UN estimates that 40% of the casualties in Gaza are children. It's appalling. And why there isn't more of an international outcry on this, I do not know. But what I want to do now is look and think about some of these questions and some of these statistics by bringing in the panel that we have and that we're very fortunate to hear from. Just very quickly, I will just introduce the panel. We have Bushra Khalidi, who's the policy lead for the occupied Palestinian territory of Oxfam, and she will frame the current situation in the OPT and the violations against children reported. Dr. Sevasti Foka is the senior lecturer in psychology at Queen Mary University, and she'll focus on psychological interventions and responses for war-affected children, and specifically will talk on the focus of the importance of identifying factors that contribute to the resilience among Palestinian war-affected children and youth, and integrating these factors into the psychosocial interventions and preventative measures designed for Palestinian child populations. And we have Keiran, who's the head of humanitarian input at the War Child Alliance, and he'll talk about the Gaza conflict and implications for the humanitarian response and approach to trauma recovery. And he'll also broadly link it to OPT and a comparison to other conflicts. So with further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Bushra Khalidi, who is the policy lead for the occupied Palestinian territory for Oxfam.
Thank you so much for having me. And just a little caveat, I used to work for Save the Children and was a legal aid lawyer for children in London. So I think that's what brings me here today. And I just want to explain that Oxfam doesn't do much work specifically with children, as we have child rights organization like War Child Holland, Save the Children, and DCI here in country that really specialize in that work. But I'm able to obviously speak because of my past work, but also because I'm following the humanitarian situation too closely, being based here in Ramallah. So thank you so much for having me and inviting me today on this panel. And I hope I can share a glimpse into the reality of what children are facing in the OPT, particularly in Gaza and the West Bank, and including East Jerusalem. We've been living under a prolonged Israeli military occupation and a really brutal Israeli blockade for decades. And this is what has created the conditions today where we're seeing a flagrant violation of fundamental human rights and international humanitarian law, and subjecting really children to unimaginable suffering. We often actually have heard the phrase from different UN agencies and different officials that Gaza has become a graveyard for children. And I'm actually here to tell you kind of what that actually means. As you mentioned, Saleyha, last week, Save the Children did announce that more than 20,000 children were missing. These include children who have been separated from their families, some that are unaccompanied, children who are trapped under the rubble and presumed dead, children who have been buried in unmarked mass graves, and children who have been detained and disappeared by Israeli forces and held until today in unknown locations, where we know they face brutal violence from what we've seen of detainees released from these military detention centers, including, the real risk of torture and abuse. In many of these cases, there are family members tortured while waiting for news about their children. We call this ambiguous loss, and really it's the most stressful type to parents. They're waiting for news that may never come, and not even given really the right to closure. And really, this type of anguish, no parent should ever have to go through. For many other children, there are no other surviving family members, no next of kin. Many other children's bodies were found, but harmed beyond recognition, making it almost impossible to really establish their identity. Parents are picking up shrouds of their children, the body parts they've managed to pick up and put into plastic bags. These atrocities come on top of more than 14,000 children that the Ministry of Health reports have been killed, and thousands maimed and lost their legs and lost their arms and are facing life-altering injuries. If children survive in Gaza, they're left to go on with life on their own, with no one to celebrate their birthdays or their achievements. This year, actually, the Secretary General of the United Nations named perpetrators of grave violations against children in Gaza the West Bank and Israel, including the IDF, Qassam brigades, and Al-Quds forces last week in the CAC, the Children Armed Conflict Conference. This, of course, was a step in the right direction for accountability, but it needs to be extremely clear that these entities should have been named a very long time ago. Failure to name these entities in the past has actually fueled this climate of impunity and dehumanization, where the killing of children has been normalized, often referred to as collateral damage. Last September, actually, Save the Children as well had already warned that 2023 was the deadliest year for Palestinian children in the West Bank since records had ever begun, and that's before the war started. So decades of impunity in Gaza and its dehumanizing effect on children is why we are here today. And I think it's very important to contextualize this. I often get asked, why are so many children being killed? Gaza is basically an enclave of children. They make up more than half of the population. Children are actually 7 times more likely to be killed by explosive weapons than adults. Their bodies are thrown harder and faster by blasts. Their bones bend more, increasing the chance of deformity. Children in Gaza have been killed in the most horrific ways imaginable. They've been dismembered, they've been burned alive, they've been mutilated by bullets and crushed by falling rubble. Foreign supplied weapons are directly playing their part into this. Before Israel's expanded ground incursion into Rafah in the beginning of May, one of our colleagues told us that the number of children that you see without limbs in Rafah was absolutely staggering. Children without leg and who are starved, they can't actually flee to so-called safe zones. Actually, more than 34 children have been recorded to have died because of starvation. And these are only children whose parents have managed to get them to the actual hospital. Dying from starvation is actually incredibly painful. When children get hungry, their bodies, they weaken, muscles waste away, their vision starts blurring, their immune system starts shutting down, their heart stops, their organs fail, and at this stage, children are too weak to cry. Last weekend, we heard of a woman, a 38-year-old woman. She came to a malnutrition center and she weighed 34 kilos. Mothers that can't breastfeed when they don't get enough nutrients has irreparable harm on the growth and development of Palestinian society for generations to come. Children suffering from acute malnutrition are at a high risk, of course, of dying from common diseases like hepatitis A, cholera, diarrhea, etc. In Gaza, we're seeing increased rates of jaundice, diarrhea, like I said, even people are dying from common colds. When people are facing starvation, flooding them with food actually can kill them because they need a full medical response. They can't just be thrown a piece of bread and a can of beans at. Whether or not the situation slightly improves, the damage to children really in Gaza has already been done. We're not even given the space to help them as humanitarians. In June, after Israel expanded the Rafah offensive, more than 3,000 children were being treated for acute malnutrition. Now we don't even know where they are. The humanitarian aid response in Gaza is on the verge of collapse for months. The killing, as you know, of the 7 World Central Kitchen international workers shocked the world the first week of April. But at that point, there was already 200 Palestinian aid workers that had been killed. And since then, attacks on aid operations have only increased. A week later, there was an attack on UNICEF, on a UN worker was killed. Basically, there are Palestinian aid workers that are killed every single week. Even in the last 7 days, Red Cross facilities, UNRWA facilities, and several humanitarian agencies have been attacked. Not only that, we're also now noticing attacks on Gaza's top water engineers. Several of Gaza's municipal workers were killed. We've also seen last week an official responsible for coordinating ambulance movement was also killed. These are the community structures that us humanitarian organizations actually we rely on to do our work. And when we talk about there being a breakdown of law and order in Gaza, it's not only because people are being starved and desperate, of course, but it's because these attacks are on the very foundations that govern Palestinian society in Gaza. Even us, Oxfam thankfully has not had yet any humanitarian colleagues killed, but And I know Keiran knows our colleague Sameh, who worked for Save the Children, and he was killed with 33 members of his family, including his wife and his 4 children, Muhammad, Hiba, Zaina, and Zain. They're all under 12 years old. The airstrikes brought 4 floors of concrete crashing down, and Sameh, his wife, and 4 kids were on the bottom floor. And for weeks, actually, the community was unable to recover our colleague's body. Why? Because the 17-year blockade means that well-meaning community volunteers don't have the equipment to do it. It took weeks to recover the bodies. There's no fuel, there's no equipment. And even by some miracle, if they had survived, surrounding medical teams likely wouldn't have been able to get to him. So to normalize this level of death and destruction is not just dangerous to Palestinians and to Gaza or aid workers, but it's actually dangerous for humanity. And we cannot let this be the new normal. Moving on to the West Bank, the situation for children is equally terrifying. Imagine being a child in the West Bank. Your home, instead of being a safe haven, is a place of constant fear and uncertainty. Actually, just last Friday, my family home in the Old City was forcibly entered and is now occupied by illegal Israeli settlers. This home has been in my family for generations, hundreds of years. And it's actually this impunity that's allowed such acts to occur. And it even affects me. And I have the immense privilege of sitting here before you today and speak to you about it. But actually, most Palestinians don't have that opportunity. And that's just one example of the daily reality of Palestinians, including children who bear the brunt of these injustices. Forcible displacement in the West Bank is rampant. It leaves children particularly vulnerable to mental health problems, and I'm sure we'll hear more about it in our panel today, because they've experienced not just one trauma, but multiple in a short period of time. Over 240 children from the West Bank remain in Israeli military prisons, with 60 held without charge under administrative detention. Actually, Palestinian children are the only children in the world who are prosecuted in military courts. Since October, you can imagine the situation has just absolutely spiraled and worsened, with clear signs of torture and inhumane treatment inflicted on children as young as 13 by Israeli forces. This has involved severe beatings, humiliations, insults, and deprivations of lawyers' visits. Israeli settlers and forces, they systematically target your family's land and property. They strip away the very means of sustaining yourself. Food insecurity is also rampant in the West Bank, especially since October 7th. Families are said to be skipping meals so their children can eat. And this, again, it's a blatant violation of the basic human right to food. Since October, almost 200,000 Palestinian workers have been denied access to their jobs inside Israel and the settlements. And that's devastated the economy here in the West Bank, and it's really tore apart countless families. Families are forced to cut expenditures on food and education, and many children, as a result, drop out of school to be able to work and support their families. And that, of course, further jeopardizes their well-being. Violence is really a daily reality here in the West Bank. Settler attacks have surged by 31% since last year at the same time, with settlers destroying or damaging, for example, 43,000 Palestinian-owned trees since October. Actually, my own friend was killed by a settler on her way driving back home to her children in February. Children witness really their homes being demolished, their schools attacked, and their parents beaten or killed. Since October, 521 Palestinians, including 126 children, have been killed in the West Bank, with many more injured. Excessive use of force by Israeli forces is just coupled with the gross lack of accountability and impunity has just resulted in an unprecedented situation in the West Bank. Even before 7th of October, like I said, it was the deadliest year for children in the West Bank on record. Attending school in the West Bank is also fraught with danger. Schools face attacks and military raids. You must have heard of the military raids in Jenin and Tulkarem in the last 7 months, and other hotspots around the West Bank. Israeli checkpoints are littered around the cities. It makes it impossible for us to move from one city to the other. Schools here in the West Bank are also facing demolition. There's about 56 schools facing Israeli demolitions. Since October, actually 62 children have been killed on their way to school in Palestine. And I find that shocking because I have a son of my own, and just to think that that's, a possibility is it's flabbergasting. And so this constant threat of violence, it leaves just children, of course, traumatized and completely uncertain about their future with no really hope for the future. Even though schools are out now, children have told us that the military raids are frequent throughout the year. Actually, we work with clusters, and there's different clusters for different themes. And there's a cluster called and it's where it brings together the UN and NGO partners and local partners, where we discuss the priorities for the week. And there's a cluster called the protection cluster. They've noted the most disturbing trends of delivering, basically. So we deliver hygiene kits to girls at school as part of the response. Because a lot of times when there's a military raid, the school shuts down and asks the kids to stay inside the school, and they might stay there for hours until the tanks have left the area or the school. So they've asked for us to include, we usually in our response kits for kids, we include like a sanitary pad for girls and underwear in case there's an accident and they're locked up in the school. It's been really disturbing that communities have actually asked us to include underwear for boys because of how much they pee themselves from the sheer terror. I want to share the story of Mahmoud Hamadna. He's a quiet 9th grade student at Al-Qarama Basic School for Boys. Mahmoud was only 15 years old when he was shot dead while riding his bicycle home from school during a raid. He had assured his father that he was safe on the phone, but minutes later, he was fatally wounded by an Israeli sniper in the back. Mahmoud bled for over half an hour before being found, but it was, of course, too late. His life was tragically cut by Israeli forces' violence. Health facilities are also attacked in the West Bank, not just in Gaza, and movement restrictions prevent access to clinics and hospitals. Emergency services face constant delays at checkpoints, and often these can have fatal consequences. Since October, there have actually been 500 attacks on healthcare in the West Bank. Israel's systematic policy of demolition, destruction, forcible displacement, detention, it's not a reality just for Gaza. It's also been one for the West Bank and East Jerusalem for years. Israeli authorities continue to demolish Palestinian-owned structures, and they often cite the lack of Israeli-issued building permits. But these demolitions, they result in injuries, they result in death, they result in pain, really, and really significant damage across the board. On June 13th, there was actually a 10-hour Israeli operation in the Jenin refugee camp, and it displaced 11 families. And this is a recurrent reality. The international community just cannot remain silent, and I cannot echo more where is the outcry, really. By staying silent, it continues to dehumanize Palestinian children while fueling Israel's impunity. Actually, where you are, and I don't know exactly where you're based, but your countries and your respective governments have actually a critical role in holding Israel accountable for its actions under international law. And us, we need to use our leverage, and these are our representatives need to use their leverage and their tools. They have tools available to them where they can demand and take action to end the violence, to end the demolitions, to end the Israeli occupation on Palestinians. We need to stop sending weapons to Israeli settlers and to Israel, and we need to hold everybody accountable for their actions. Everybody has a role in promoting accountability for violations of international law. And it's essential for countries to show that Israel's violations cannot continue to be unchecked. And your governments need to investigate these violations and need to prosecute those responsible. Officials should be held responsible for war crimes if they aid and abet these actions. There's one more thing. I mean, I implore you to remember the faces of the children of Gaza and the West Bank and their humanity. They're not mere statistics. They're young lives. They're filled with potential. They yearn for a chance to grow, just like my own child and your own children. We can't allow Israel's continuous impunity to fuel more suffering. We have to stand together. We have to raise our voices. We have to be brave, just like I am being brave today, and demand justice and accountability in a future where Palestinian children can really thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bushra. Gosh, I don't know how many people are sort of, moved and choked and motivated and driven by what you've just said. Thank you. And I know we went over, but there is just no way on earth that I was going to stop that. So thank you so much. Thank you. We will come back to many of the things that you have said together with the panel for the Q&A. I want to move on now, if I may, to Dr. Sevasti Foka, who is Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Queen Mary University. Over to you, Dr. Foka.
Thank you so much, Bushra. I mean, I can't imagine how brave you are, and thank you for sharing all this information to us. I'm speechless, honestly. And thank you, Saleyha, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation into this event. Is it okay if I'm going to share my screen and share my presentation? Is this okay? Yeah, great. I think, Saleyha, I think you should give me the, you should give me permission to share.
I won't have that right. I wonder if the
Let me
coordinator can
check
help.
1 second.
Not sure.
No?
Okay. Yes, let me just try again now.
Is it
Yes.
okay? I'm just.
Can I send you the slides? Maybe you can share.
Not for me, because I will have a problem. But
Okay.
Send it
is there
to
any way?
me.
Because time is ticking. Is it possible to do it without the slides? Yeah.
Yes, I can do this without. Yes. Okay. So let me go to myself on the. I'm going to discuss today preventive measures and psychological interventions for war-affected children, and in particular for Palestinian child and youth populations. I am a lecturer at Queen Mary University, and for the last 7 years we have been working with a lot of vulnerable child populations and youth populations that were forcibly displaced and war affected. Before I move on to describe the kind of work we are doing and what we know at the moment regarding preventive measures for Palestinian populations, let me just describe a little bit the research that we have available regarding the mental health of war-affected children. We know that the mental health includes risk and protective factors. Risk factors may be depression, anxiety, and exposure to violence, and protective factors are unique to the specific populations of children and young people, and really promote resilience building skills. So for child refugee populations in the last 5 years, there is extensive research which shows that risk factors are associated with prolonged exposure to violence, and the more violence that children are exposed to, the more mental health issues develop. Also, one risk factor is the loss of family and peer support. And those children, for example, Syrian children or children from Afghanistan and other places, they face a lot of depression and anxiety because of the loss of social networks. They are basically abandoned, and because their families were lost during the bombings, etc. Now, research though shows, and this is a hopeful idea, research shows that the majority of these children who are war affected and they are forcibly displaced, they show a lot of resilience. They are extremely brave and they are extremely mature in the way that they respond to these unfortunate circumstances. This resilience is associated with specific protective factors for the war-affected children, such as parental support, peer support from friends, that who they play together and they share these experiences, and also positive school experiences were found to have a positive impact on child psychological functioning. Now, in particular, I'm just going to describe what we know about the mental health of Palestinian child populations. Very recent research in 2024 has shown, and I'm sure Bushra has indicated all these mental health issues, but I'm just going very quickly to repeat that this very recent research has shown extremely high rates of anxiety, of traumatic stress, a lot of externalizing and internalizing symptoms. So children, Palestinian children have an extra difficulty to express their sadness and their emotions in general. It has shown very high rates of pressure. And this is a word that is used among the Palestinian child populations. In Arabic, it is called dahed nafsi. And this captures the distress that they feel because of the bombings, this high exposure to violence. They see dead bodies, they feel threatened for a long time. Now, also, regarding mental health for Palestinian child populations, we know that trauma has very unique characteristics that we can't ignore when designing these preventive measures, which are going to be effective for these populations. Trauma is accumulated. Dr. Samah Jabr, who is the head of the mental health unit in the Palestinian Ministry of Health, she's describing the trauma as accumulated and intergenerational. It is trauma which people experience over 5 different generations. This is, I mean, we have never experienced as mental health professionals in the whole of the world a trauma which lasts over decades. Okay, and this indicates its significance. Also, trauma is collective. Okay, it is associated, the psychological trauma that these children experience in Palestine it is associated with the collective trauma of their families, of their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, etc. Also, there is a term that we use when describing war-affected mental health. We use the term post-traumatic stress disorder. And this actually captures all this very severe impact that experiencing violence and bombings and all this death, the impact that this has on the person, on the human being. Regarding the Palestinian experience, we have taken the post out of the post-traumatic stress disorder because it's not post, it's not over. So whatever we design in interventions, and this is based on the information of Dr. Jabr is providing to us, whatever we design as intervention should include this idea of the characteristics of the specific trauma, which is not post, is not over. It is ongoing and repetitive. So please keep in mind these two unique terms, ongoing trauma and repetitive trauma. Now, also, what very recent research has shown is that although this is the mental health context that we have to work with in developing these preventive measures to help these children and young people. But a lot of mental health professionals who are working in Palestine for many years have come up with a word which is related to resilience as we know it in the Western world, which is called somud. So research has demonstrated that somud has quite a lot of similar characteristics with the term resilience and is characterized by the prolonged resistance of these people, of the children, young people and their families in the face of prolonged adversity. It is characterized by strong community cohesion. These people are so well connected with each other. I mean, it is amazing the stories that come up from the research that have documented people immediately trying to help when there is a need, other people, children going to help their peers during bombings. So somud, resilience in the Palestinian culture is associated with community cohesion and a strong social support. Also, it is associated with a very strong belief system. Religion is very important and faith is very important for the children and their families. And also somud is related to patience. It is incredible, but very recent research in just last month has shown that although this incredible, very dark moments that children, young people and their families, they go through, they show a lot of bravery and patience under these circumstances. So these are very valuable information when designing the psychosocial support measures and mental health interventions. at Queen Mary a few years ago, we have developed a resilience building skills intervention. And this was delivered in 3 different countries in the Greek humanitarian settings among Syrian and Palestine child populations. It was last year delivered in Lebanon in 2 Palestine refugee camps. And very recently, a couple of months ago, we have delivered this intervention in orphanages in Kenya. So this intervention is a structured 6-day intervention, it was developed in direct response to the needs of war-affected children. The research that we have conducted shows great improvements in the self-esteem, in hopeful thinking, in depression, great improvements in depression, and also it's a non-clinical approach. This is
Dr. Foka, could I ask you to wrap up now, please?
Yes,
We can come
I'm
back.
just going in the final thoughts. Drawing upon this experience that we had with other war-affected child populations, we could say that preventive measures should try to address the characteristics of the Palestinian trauma, which is collective, ongoing, and repetitive. Also, interventions should be placed within the community and in a collective manner. So they should be group-based and preventive interventions, not clinical interventions as such. And finally, my final thought is, in order to wrap up, is that intervention should definitely utilize the social capital. And so we should definitely raise awareness in building community capacity. So the people in Palestine, the community leaders, religious leaders, these are the people who could deliver preventive measures and psychosocial support interventions.
Thank you so much for that.
So much. Yes, I'm sorry, I may have. Yes.
Right, so could I now ask Keiran King, head of the Humanitarian section of War Child Alliance, to come on? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess I'm following on from horrible kind of depictions of what's happening at the moment on the ground in Gaza. My presentation now is going to be a bit more focused on maybe a bit more clinical in its terminology, not in terms of psychological clinical, but focus more on the practical of what is being done at the moment in the scope of what can be done, but also what can be done and what should be being put in place now to address some of these things. I'm going to be talking about the aid operation itself, but with a focus on what is actually directly relevant to the impact on mental health, psychosocial support, and acute trauma of children, and also some of the factors that make Gaza unique as a context today compared to other conflicts. And I just want to caveat that there is no good news here as well. I'm not leaving this as a third speaker, leaving with a clear message of hope. But there are solutions that are within our control. So I'll just highlight what some of those are as well. So jumping straight in, I think what makes trauma in Gaza unique is the sheer consistency of it. You know, there's no respite. We've heard about the collective trauma already from Sevasti. What is unique as well is the density as well. When you're talking about acute trauma at a population level, you're talking about the aid system and civil society within Gaza. There's no precedent for that. So the question we've been asking, I say we being the humanitarian system, collectively through clusters and everything else, is how do you address acute trauma at a population level? There's never been a challenge like this before. So we don't have those structures, systems, best practice to fall back on, and how we organize ourselves and how we address that challenge. Usually, it's difficult to compare conflicts, right? Every conflict is unique in its own ways, but usually you see populations fleeing, a general trend of populations fleeing to safer areas, and those repeated traumas that we've been talking about. And redisplacement, while there's a common, you usually see a general trend of reduced exposure, which allows then first aid, recovery, and a general increase in access to specialist services. That's not the case in Gaza today, and Gaza is unique in that trend is reversed. Families are being pushed into smaller and smaller areas of Gaza, redisplaced to different areas within Gaza, and have an exponentially increased exposure to traumatic incidents, and also the vicarious effects of that as well. We heard about collective trauma, and that collective trauma being compounded day by day. I saw there was a small video from one of our partner organizations in Gaza that was shared with me, which showed one of the recreation activities that this partner had gathered a group of children in one of the designated shelters in a supposed safe zone, doing some activity, intervention called Team Up, which is children coming together, playing games, singing songs, etc., trying to provide some momentary respite. And you see the momentary relief on the a semblance of joy on the faces of the children in that video. And about 20 seconds into the video, a car is blown up 100 meters behind, and you see the immediate switch and the fear in the eyes of the children, who then just scatter and they run, so that, I think that just gives a sense of how difficult it is today. And I'm not going to talk about all the specific barriers to delivering an aid operation in Gaza, because there are many and we could be here for an hour. But what I do want to talk about is the things specific to MHPSS in particular. And I think, the trauma in Gaza is not unique, it's not new. Many organizations have been working in Gaza for decades, including my organization, War Child, and Bushra and I worked together for Save the Children as well for a number of years. And the unfortunate reality is the cycle of violence and the cycle of aggression on Gaza and the impact of the blockade means that there was, and I'm sorry to use this terminology, but a kind of a rinse and repeat approach to how you address the impact of one escalation after another. There were kind of very closely knit coordination structures, roles and responsibilities agreed between civil society and what the role of international NGOs would be on the ground in supporting local organizations. There was a cluster system that worked. All of that's broken down and no longer applicable. So we're rebuilding that. I say rebuilding, we're not at the point where we can yet rebuild it. And what prevents us from doing so is that unique to Gaza, and I would say, and others might challenge this, but I would say over the course of the span of the past 30 years, there's never been an aid operation that exists on the battlefield. This is new. Yes, you have frontline workers working in conflict. You've got people on and behind front lines reaching children and providing services, but you've never had your warehouses in the middle of the active conflict zone. You've never had NGO offices in the middle of the conflict zone. You've never had every single humanitarian aid worker on the ground of a particular conflict themselves displaced. These are unique challenges for which today there are few solutions to other than an immediate ceasefire, which is why organizations are calling for this so urgently and have been with limited success until now. There's also a lack of a functioning national infrastructure and locally mandated authority. There was before, there are massive challenges with that due to counterterrorism legislation and shrinking space, and we could have a whole webinar on that, and the challenges the humanitarian community faced before the current war. But without having a functioning or recognized kind of civil authority in Gaza today, it's very difficult to embed investments, I guess, in different services and how you kind of develop an operating platform and how services are integrated into kind of functioning civil services, etc. So that's a massive challenge. What is remaining, though, in absence of that, is civil society in Gaza. But everyone is affected, including counsellors, mental health professionals, those that were there. There were 2,500 kind of trained counsellors, for example, on the ground in Gaza. We don't know at the moment how many of those are able to sort of work and how many have left to Egypt, etc. But there'll be a need to bring that together. But there is already now a kind of technical drain, I guess, of specialists within national organizations. And that's in part, Israel's not only to blame for this. This is also the INGO and UN community as well, and how we approach the scale up of an aid operation in the context such as Gaza, where there's often a big rush to spend donor funds, be seen to be delivering results, etc. And one of the natural tendencies is to, okay, we recruit staff, but the implication of that is you get technical staff drawn away from technical roles in national institutions to work in non-technical roles in other organizations. So that's a challenge that we're seeing now. And I was in a meeting with our War Child's partners in Egypt about 2 weeks ago, where they reported already experiencing this phenomenon. I say phenomenon, it's normal to every conflict, it's normal to every aid operation, but it's one that we have to do better at today in Gaza. The other challenge to the aid operation is its counterterrorism legislation and shrinking space. I mentioned it already as being prevalent before. There are still no contact policies that exist and linked to donor compliance, but also embedded in US, UK, and EU law, which prevent us from doing what we need to do on the ground. There are very, very real risks of indictments, legal indictments in the UK, US, and EU, and also risks for our staff, for humanitarian workers who, for example, might live in Jerusalem or the West Bank. Like Bushra mentioned administrative detention. There's a very real risk of INGO staff, local NGO staff being arrested, and if we're not, taking unreasonable measures to demonstrate that there is no actual perceived diversion of aid to prescribed or designated terrorist organizations. The short-term funding and planning as well is another challenge as well. There's absolutely right that the priority right now is on basic needs, but when it comes to how you design and position for a much wider kind of trauma response and recovery process, that's something that will become an increasing challenge as the nature of the conflict changes and the current phase we're in changes into another phase where hopefully we hope access is kind of increased. Coordination is another challenge as well, which everyone is facing. I think that we've mentioned clusters and the UN system, and that was functioning, it was there, but that collapsed and is in the process of being rebuilt. There is a protection cluster. Within that, there's a mental health and psychosocial support working group. That's exacerbated by or challenged by the fact that deployments to lead those coordination groups are very short term, and we're seeing a cycle of staff in and out of those. So it's very difficult to kind of make progress in how to coordinate and come together as multiple organizations, national, international. And the phenomenon that we will see and need to be prepared for is that as access increases, which we hope comes sooner rather than later, in lieu of a ceasefire or change in Israel's approach and tactics, is that we will see a circus. We will see multiple organizations coming in, all of them wanting to deliver psychosocial services or mental health services, psychological first aid, and how you coordinate that needs to be designed, right? And so that's the process we're in at the moment for those organizations who have been there a long time, who are active members of these clusters of working groups. How you pull those different actors in so you have one approach to building a mental health or helping to recover a mental health and psychosocial support infrastructure and care system and policy. So just moving to briefly, because I'm probably out of time, but solutions, I don't have any, but there are some adaptations, and there are things that we can that are in our control now when it comes to planning and positioning for a meaningful and appropriate mental health and trauma recovery program. And there's still value today, I believe. There are organizations, ours is one, but multiple national organizations in Gaza who have decades of experience in providing trauma recovery and psychological first aid, doing that today. Recreational activities, counseling, there is the helper kind of initiatives set up, and there are remote helplines, which we can imagine how effective those are. It's something, but certainly not enough. Increasingly, there are ebbs and flows in how much local organizations are able to reach people to provide repeat services and sessions in terms of direct face-to-face counselling. But organisations are trying, and it is happening, but no, I'm not going to say nowhere near enough, obviously. It doesn't even scratch the surface of what's needed. The approach we have to take, if we're going to set up that meaningful system, is enriching, not competing with civil society actors. We've spoken about the long-term effects of compounded trauma. That requires long-term solutions, and it requires forward planning. You know, yes, the humanitarian system is stuck in the acute phase today, but now is the time to be planning for whatever the next phase. And be careful with my words here, not to sort of repeat other words that others have used. But whatever the next phase is, and when that comes, got to make sure we have organised, we have invested, we have mobilised, so that there is a joint approach to rebuilding the mental health policy system and critically workforce. I think if you're going to, Sevasti spoke about community cohesion and social capital. At the moment we're involved, we're working with WHO and a consortium of other mental health sort of focused organisations, particularly local actors in Gaza, to develop a pathway for buzzwords coming out here, but pathway for developing that mental health policy system and workforce, and how that can then be integrated into the health and education systems in particular as those are rebuilt as institutions. But particularly how that's built alongside community cohesion as that is developed to allow that to be embedded within social capital and civil society. Supporting the really practical things, though, are how we support local organisations, and I can't emphasise that enough. It's not going to be the international community responding to acute trauma in Gaza a year from now. It's going to be local institutions, it's going to be local organisations, it will be civil society who are the ones who remain. So right now, what can we do now? All of our partners' offices, for example, we work with 6 different organisations on the ground in Gaza, all of whom have had their offices destroyed, all of them have had all of their staff displaced. We need to work alongside the delivery of services today, investing in operational support to re-establish their platforms. At the moment, there's a tendency, of course, different international organisations, UN, coming in to establish their own platforms. That can't be at the expense of investing in laptops, in printers, in and maybe today is not the right time given those organisations are displaced, but that needs to be in budgets. It needs to be budgeted today. It needs to be available to those organisations when they need it and can use it. We need to benchmark our salaries as international organisations and UN against local market rates in Gaza to mitigate that technical drain away from national institutions that are going to be the safeguard of Gaza's future, particularly when it comes to mental health and psychosocial support that requires specialists. And the other difficult conversation is that there will be more new phases to this conflict. Even after a ceasefire, when there is peace, about 3 years ago, we saw the designation of 6 civil society organisations in the West Bank as terrorist organisations by Israel. That collapsed the ability of international organisations to work with those local actors. There's nothing stopping that from happening in Gaza once the eyes are off Gaza in whatever the next phase is. So we need to be ready to defend those organisations, to first enrich and rebuild civil society and then defend it when the time comes. And then demilitarising is the final point I wanted to make. We're at real risk in terms of the aid operation in Gaza of it becoming militarised, and we've seen that can be actual or perceived. So we saw lots of news about the US peer, largely ineffective, a bit of a distraction, I think, as were the aid drops as well. These are distractions that feed into this false narrative of Israel and others like facilitating this heavy infrastructure aid operation. It's an illusion. What the risk is now is that we see collaboration between US, UK, France, other militaries with the government of Israel and the Israeli offensive forces, which so that, for example, rumours unevidenced as of today, I understand that might have changed, that the US peer, for example, was used as a point of departure for hostages who were recaptured. That's incredibly dangerous for the aid operation in terms of trust of communities, of humanitarian organisations. So that needs to be safeguarded, and that's embedded in our humanitarian principles of independence, and that is something we need a joint approach to defend as well. I could keep talking for days, so maybe I'll stop there, and there are other things I can cover. I'll wait for the questions.
Thank you so much for that, Keiran. Absolutely, safeguarding humanitarian infrastructure, the emblem, for example, everything that has been so misused, that society depends on, trust, for example, in these structures to protect. I know we said 2:15, but that was mainly because I have another appointment. But so the organisers kindly said 2:15 instead of 2:30. But if we go over 2:15 once we're in the conversation, so be it. I'll be late for the other thing because this is too important. So I just wanted to kick things off very quickly. We do have some questions in the Q&A box, and I will ask the audience if you can please pop your questions into the Q&A box, and I will pass them on to the panel. But one thing I want to ask, and this is to maybe to all of you really, but it's about other countries and who have suffered trauma and who have built. And I think of Algeria, because it's a country that I've looked at quite a bit, and the decades of violence that their community and population suffered under French colonialism, and then the subsequent wars of independence, etc., that they fought, leading right up to the 1980s and 90s. That is a population who suffered significant trauma at many levels, with 1 million people killed. Are there any lessons learned, or any offers of solidarity or sharing experience as to how they've tackled it with what is going on with Gaza now? I think it's about solidarity with coming out as civil society and marching on the streets is one thing. I wondered whether there is anything professionally within the mental health and trauma-related sphere where people have experienced and emerged from trauma themselves are sharing their experiences. And if not, how do we build that network of shared experience to learn from each other? And I'll pop that to Bushra first.
I mean, I think it's a difficult question to answer. I don't think there's, I think different children experience trauma differently across the board. I don't want to compare what's happening in Palestine to other horrific crises that happen elsewhere. And I don't want to undermine, in any way, the trauma of other children around the world, regardless of, what that stems from. But I think what Sevasti was saying is very important in terms of the post and the post-traumatic stress. We're like always, we're here in Palestine in a constant situation of trauma because, the violations and the violence is a daily reality. So, I mean, I've only worked in the Palestinian context in an emergency way, but I think I think it also depends on the children. It depends on the environment they come from. It depends, even like children in Gaza and children, for example, from Ramallah are very different and have very different levels of resilience. Children in Gaza have unfortunately been forced into much higher levels of resilience that maybe children in Ramallah, where I'm living, because of their exposure to, constant violence. Also, something that's interesting is, for example, children in Gaza are not normalized to seeing soldiers and Israeli soldiers. Or military personnel at all, because the blockade meant that Israel, and Israel like kind of left in 2005 and dismantled settlements and basically kind of was not occupying in the same way that it is in the West Bank. Whereas children here in the West Bank, they're not afraid of soldiers because it's a daily reality. We see them every day. We have to go through the checkpoints where, either strip search or check their identities every day. So it's something that's very normalized and I've spoken to a lot of children in the last 9 months in Gaza, and some of the most traumatic moments was not actually the bomb it was actually when they were faced with Israeli soldiers inside Gaza. Like that were, I think, very marking moments, not just for children, but for people in general, because they actually had never met an Israeli before, only through airstrikes from air. And it's the first time that Israeli troops make their way into Gaza in the way they have in the last 9 months. So I think that was quite interesting. So I think it's just like, you know, you can't generalize it. But I think my colleagues are better positioned to speak on this.
Yeah, absolutely that. So it's definitely not to generalize it. It's like some, you know, if a country or a population or a generation have been through an experience, is there information sharing? It's something that we do in medicine, for example. We share knowledge that we have gained in one area of medicine and expertise, and we want to share it with others so that if there are any crossovers or lessons learned. And I just wonder, Dr. Foka, Sevasti, whether you have utilized for things that might have worked in other conflict settings, because lots of things are tried and tested, and whether anything that has been learned from an acute conflict setting that will cause trauma that could then be used as a tool elsewhere. Obviously, with what's going on in Gaza right now is something I don't think we've ever experienced before, and I think Gaza will actually teach us a lot. We will learn much in the management of trauma from the experiences of people in Gaza and children in particular going through.
Yes, I think this is an excellent question, and but it's I am sure that there are a lot of specialists out there that are sharing information. It's just that there is not enough organization to, if we could organize ourselves and share the knowledge, what works for this population, for Syrian children who have experienced war trauma, because they have experienced bombings and loss of a beloved one, and I mean, it's one of the things that we at Queen Mary, we were very, very fond of, is to collect the people's, the NGOs' experiences with working with these children in Syria and in other places, collecting this knowledge and informing the preventive measures based on this knowledge. And we have mapped the statements from mental health carers and professionals and doctors and volunteers who were working with child populations in hosting countries, but also in humanitarian settings. We have collected this information and we have used this, we have utilized this and used this in order to draw these interventions. For example, I remember a teacher a Syrian teacher who we have met in a refugee camp in a Greek island. She has mentioned that those children who were actually captured and they were imprisoned, and there is a huge number of children who have kept with their families or without their families in prison in Syria. She has mentioned that we should design interventions and activities, and the school activities should be outside of a dark building. And when we actually used this knowledge, we have transferred the activities, the intervention, everything, the educational activities, the art activities, even dancing outside of their homes. And this has increased attendance by 37% of the children, because we are going there and we act on a volunteering basis. If the children want to follow this educational psychosocial support activities, they come to us. So basically, this has increased attendance. And I have come across with a lot of children who said to me that because this now is placed in a park, in here outside in the woods, this is much easier for me to participate because I'm scared to go inside anywhere. So basically, absolutely, we can learn from this kind of experiences.
Thank you. Just very quickly, Keiran, I just want to know though, Dr. Sevasti talked about, organising ourselves, and I suppose at an NGO level, and you're working, as you mentioned, with the WHO, with War Child and other NGOs. I just want to get a sense of, are NGOs talking to each other, and maybe it's at that level that information sharing can happen and be facilitated. And then disseminated down, or is everyone still working in silos?
It ebbs and flows, right? And that is one of the primary functions of the coordination mechanism. Yes, they're quite kind of operational to make sure people aren't duplicating activities for the same children, or to make sure there are no gaps left, for example, in services. But also, it is intended to I'd say regulate. There is the MHPSS working group that I mentioned before, but there's also the mental health psychosocial support minimum care package, and that is something that is regularly updated and designed to reflect lessons learned from previous conflicts, for example, and apply. The reality, though, right, is the day-to-day. It's difficult. That I can say this from myself. I've led a number of emergency responses for different organizations, and it's difficult to make the time to really stop and reflect and plan to make sure those are incorporated and coordinated across kind of partner organizations, but also that different organizations are supporting themselves through the cluster and working group system. So that there is, in the acute phase as we are in for Gaza right now, it's very challenging. However, that's why there's such an important, not today, I'd say, but needs to be such a focus on forward planning and designing what the response is and what the collective response is to the next phase of the conflict. So that's where taking the time, I think, as organizations to form a coalition separate to the ongoing focus on basic needs and the immediate response, to plan in terms of mental health and trauma recovery. What is the mental health policy? What lessons does it integrate? Does it put in? What does the system look like? How has that been effective in other contexts, and how can that be applied or adapted to Gaza? And then how to build the workforce to address collective trauma at a population level, across health, across education, and how do you embed that? So I'm just giving examples, but you need to design it, right? You need people who are not involved in the day-to-day to sit down with as much of a kind of national infrastructure as possible. That's very lacking and limited, a massive gap and risk in Gaza right now. And map that out and plan it, and most importantly, then resource it as well. And that's where longer-term funding comes in, something I didn't mention so much in my thing. So yeah, it's a bit of a kind of, my answer is a bit of a needs to rather than we are. But
that's fine. And these are ideas, and I'm jotting them down. And these are, someone needs to sort of seize that baton and make that happen. We've got about 11 minutes left, and there are some questions, and I will put it to the panel. Can I ask everyone to keep their answers short? If you want to be the one that answers, less than 30 seconds if you can, or 30 seconds to a minute, so we can get through this. Right. So one question, Heart Girls, many thanks. Other than putting pressure on our government, what can we do to create immediate help on the ground? Bushra, maybe because of your being on the ground, whether I can direct that to you.
I mean, I think like don't stop supporting organizations that are working on the ground, even though our reach at the moment is minimal. At the end of the day, we know that there will be a ceasefire, and there will be a point where, you know, we will be able to maybe hopefully access more. So I think like, you know, and you're also supporting, I mean, all of our staff in Gaza are all local staff. So even, you know, you're also supporting, and they're surviving for they're fending for their families. They've been displaced multiple times. Their homes have been destroyed as well. So, you know, you're like most of the operational NGOs here actually have local staff, because a big part of our localization, our agenda is localization. So you're not only supporting operations on the ground, but you're also supporting staff that are Palestinian that are working on the ground under these circumstances. But I think more from like a kind of, and I'm a policy lead, so I'm not an operational or programmatic person. And I kind of lead on the campaigning and the advocacy work that we've been doing at Oxfam. I think it's important to just not stay silent. And I know it's exhausting. I have had more than 600 interviews, media interviews in the last 9 months, and you know, tens and tens of panels, and I'm exhausted of having to, you know, reiterate over and over again. But I you know, I will not stop. And I feel like what I've been saying to people is, if I don't stop, then you can't stop. You know, and going out and protesting and writing to your, you know, even if I know that it feels like there's so little that comes out of this, and it doesn't really have an impact. It's not translating on the ground. But it is, because we have seen a shift in the narrative as Palestinians that we've never seen before. We've never seen global support for the Palestinian cause. Palestine was forgotten, and it's back on the map like it never has been before. And that's because actually of global advocacy and campaigning, and people out on the street, the student encampments. I mean, it was phenomenal to see the support, the solidarity from the students, and what they did was really unprecedented.
Right. I'm
it's
gonna thank you for that. So just so I can move on to other questions.
Sure.
Okay, the scale of the trauma, given the scale of the trauma, can collective responses be proposed? I think, Keiran.
Yes, is the short answer. I think I've explained a bit about how there are a group of organisations and a coalition thinking ahead to how that can work. As of today, though, it is, you know, there is no gap when it comes to counselling, psychological first aid, etc. Like, as many people who know what they're doing on the ground, who are delivering other services, who are able to do that and understand how to speak to a child in the immediate aftermath of an incident helps. So yeah, there are minimum standards. There is a mental health care policy, care system, but the broader response, the longer term 5-year, 10-year, kind of 20-year response needs to be designed, and that does need to be collective, and it's the function of the clusters, and it's the function of the mental health, psychosocial support working groups, etc.
I've got quite a few questions asking for Dr. Sevasti's slides. Are you able to share them with us? If you could maybe send them to Saleyha, and then we can share them to everyone that's signed up. I'd be very grateful for those. And another thing, question that's come up, any of the resources that the panel refers to, is it possible to send them in as well? I know there were a few resources that people had resorted to, and be great if we can get those. Okay, so the next one, how can NGOs push complicit governments to stop funding and cut ties with Israel? Who wants to take that one? Go for it, Bushra.
So a few of us, we've been we've set up this huge Ceasefire Now coalition for campaigns where NGOs are basically in a coalition calling, and we have over 250 organizations that have called for an arms embargo on Israel and other parties, and that's never happened in any crisis before, this many organizations. So we try to kind of like push in the UN, push in different places. But I think like the most important thing for us to really be effective is working together and working in one voice and working in coalition. Like that is the way it works. Working in silo, especially on advocacy and campaigning, it just will not work. And I think like that's something that we've also seen that's different in Palestine in the last 9 months. We've never been this coordinated on advocacy and this aligned And we've been doing a lot of joint briefings. And as you can see, also this entire narrative has been about the humanitarian situation. And that's what we've been able to really like push against a lot of things in the media narrative, against the floating pier, the airdrops, the safe zones, all of these little pauses, all of this we've been pushing really, really hard back against. And that is the coalition of INGOs that have been behind this work. So we continue to push.
Great, wonderful, thank you. It says here so Anthony Valion asks, it seems Israel and the USA have frozen out and attacked UNRWA and the civilian administration in Gaza from doing their roles. How can that be overcome for the next phases to enable the much needed support and coordination to take place, and can they still play a part? So the attacks on organizations, I think, Keiran, you mentioned that, you were talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, UNRWA, obviously we saw accusations against UNRWA and then an immediate, I'd argue, unjustified reaction from a large number of particularly EU member states and the US to cut funding or suspend funding, they said. And there's still a number who haven't restored that, despite no evidence being provided of those accusations. So it is true that UNRWA is under fire. We talk to UNRWA as well regularly. There's a coalition of organizations working with UNRWA and to support UNRWA. A lot of the pressure, this is kind of home kind of advocacy efforts across particularly EU member states, has been quite effective in restoring funding and commitments to UNRWA from member states. It's not clear though, like what Israel's tactics will be. You know, it's no secret that UNRWA doesn't want Israel don't want UNRWA to exist, and UNRWA is essential. They're critical to the response today. There's no organization that can replace UNRWA, and without UNRWA, it's a bleak picture for the next phase of the response, at least. So organizations, I think, maintaining pressure on their own member states and the countries in which they're based, and making sure that there is that collective understanding that UNRWA that there is no emergency response and recovery from this without UNRWA. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Keiran. Given the need, and Anthony asked another question, I think I might have to, Anthony, if you could email that in instead. I think I'm going to move on to the next question so everyone gets a chance. Why are preventative and not clinical interventions needed for Palestine? And how can we test the effectiveness of the interventions? Maybe that's for, honestly, Dr. Foka, you've got less than a minute to answer that one. Preventative and not clinical interventions needed.
Basically, both will work, and the clinical approaches and the preventive approaches. It's just that preventive approaches are more appropriate because of the lack of resources in the ground, and also they reduce the idea of stigma on mental health. These are the main reasons.
Thank you very much for that. As I said, Hilary Lush has asked, could the panel provide links to the reports they mentioned, either in this chat, or I would recommend that if you could send them to Eulalia, and then we can then propagate those out. That would be helpful. Allah Al-Masri asks, my question is, how can we intervene and provide basic psychological support interventions within the current blockade of Israel? And what are the recommended interventions? So whilst we are in this now, what can we do to intervene and provide basic support psychologically? I know, War Child, you have projects that do that right now, don't you?
We do, yeah. And I mean, I'll be honest, I can't speak to the effectiveness. You know, we're not monitoring the impact of those interventions, and there's not a great deal of literature. Dr. Foka will know better than me, I think. There's not a great deal of literature demonstrating the effectiveness of the impact of psychological first aid. But it's happening, right? And I think in the current phase of what's being done, a lot of people trained on the ground in Gaza, working across a vast variety of national NGOs, delivering services today, who maybe they're distributing food parcels, maybe they're distributing shelter kits, psychological support kits, or other items. Maybe they're fixing water mains, you know, but those people knowing how to speak to a child in the immediate aftermath of an incident is critical. So psychological first aid is one. And then doing what you can in as safe a way as possible. And I say that because obviously there are risks in bringing children together in the current context, but having making space to take children out of the daily reality for even half an hour to play with other children. So that War Child have a number of interventions that we implement with our partners on the ground, related to play, and related to games and singing. And yeah, again, can't speak to the repeat trauma and the kind of longer term impact of that, but what we see is at least a smile on the child's face.
And Dr. Foka, for yourself, what if as a specialist in this area, what would be a direct intervention that you would suggest now, or you have seen working? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you for the question. Definitely, we can prepare for the next phase. I think this may be the focus, but at the moment, there are interventions that may be effective. For example, interventions which are low intensity, and they adopt a non-clinical approach. They are group-based, but as Keiran have said, I appreciate, of course, that there are a lot of risks in bringing children together, but interventions which may focus on identifying the children's strengths, their bravery, focusing on the fact that they are survivors under these circumstances. They have survived, and this is a very hopeful thing. I know it is a catastrophe, it's a tragedy, and we should all try to resist on that, but highlighting the fact that these children are have survived under these circumstances is a great thing that interventions should incorporate character strengths. And character strengths are related to self-esteem. Self-esteem is a protective factor to the most difficult situation. So I think intervention should incorporate these themes.
Right. I just want to give Bushra the final word on that. We've gone 2 minutes over. I'm a bad chair, sorry, but this is such an important subject. But
True.
Bushra, from your experiences, what have you seen help? Let's bring it back to the subject itself, psychological trauma suffered by children in Gaza and the West Bank today. What have you seen physically working and that has helped that we need to replicate and do more of?
So, I mean, I think there's been incredible programs by many local partners that we work with, where they use different things within our kind of society, which is there's a lot of like storytelling. And storytelling is actually part of our culture, where our grandparents have told us the stories of the Nakba, and that goes on for generations. But storytelling has been part of our trauma recovery. We've not recovered, but it's part of us being able to, share with others in a very open and kind of non-emotive way our experiences and our stories and they have incorporated a lot of that in a lot of programming here. For example, I know YMCA uses a lot of storytelling, which is the youth. They work with a lot of former detainees. So there's a lot of, I think it needs to be Palestinian led. I think it needs to be led by the communities. I think we know what best works for us as Palestinians. And I think we all need trauma recovery. I think it's something that's unfortunately it's all of Palestinians, us watching this and bearing witness to what is likely to be a genocide on TV is also traumatizing for Palestinians, even in the diaspora. So I think, we need to also rethink. I'm not a practitioner, and so I can't speak to that, but we need to rethink how we make sure that it's Palestinian-led and it also speaks to the Palestinian experience that is so unique. Yeah.
Thank you. Just so well said, and absolutely, yes, the power of storytelling and to be able to tell it in your own right. is so vitally important. I will put a final plea for all the panelists to share any of the resources that you mentioned in an email to Saleyha, super vital, so that this work can, the time that you've given today, what you've shared today, isn't just lost in another webinar, but people can then take that forward and use that knowledge and grow. Every ounce, every second of what you said was invaluable. So thank you so much. And for people that asked, yes, this webinar will be available and it will be put on the LIDC's YouTube channel and social media. So watch out for that. So yeah, the LIDC Twitter channel, YouTube channel and social media. Right. Okay. I am not going to take up any more of your time. I'm going to just say thank you so much for the panel for giving their time. And thank you so much for the privilege and honor given to me to chair this. It was, I'm blown away. I've got so much to think about. And I'm sure many of the audience too. Please continue the dialogue. Please continue to tweet and ask questions. This has been tweeted out on social media. So if anything has been left unanswered, please continue this conversation and let's keep it going. Once again, thank you to Bushra, Sevasti and Keiran for your time, and for the organisers, LIDC, and for you, Saleyha, for all the hard work that she's done in setting this up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.